My name is Jake Morrison, and what I'm about to tell you will change everything you think you know about corporate murder in America. I'm 58 years old now, and for 34 years I've carried the weight of watching my 5 best friends die in Devil's Throat Cave. But they didn't die in an accident. They were murdered by people in expensive suits who decided our lives were worth less than mineral rights, and I was supposed to die with them. I was 24 in 1989, working at my dad's hardware store in Oregon and feeling like life was just beginning. Mike Chen was my best friend since high school, an experienced spelunker who owned all the gear and knew which caves were safe and which ones would kill you. Sarah Williams was the girl I'd been secretly in love with since sophomore year but never had the courage to tell. Tommy Rodriguez kept everyone laughing with his jokes. Alex Porter was our thrill-seeker who craved danger, and Dave Miller was the cautious one who had a terrible feeling about our Devil's Throat Cave expedition. Dave was right to be worried, but none of us understood why until it was too late. We'd been planning this trip for months, ever since Alex heard about Devil's Throat Cave from some guy at a Portland rock climbing gym. The cave had a reputation, or locals called it cursed, said it had claimed more lives than any other cave system in the Pacific Northwest. But that just made it more appealing to us young idiots who thought we were invincible. Mike had done his research, studied the maps, checked weather forecasts, and assured us it would be perfectly safe if we followed his lead. But what Mike didn't tell us was about the strange phone call he'd received 3 days before our trip. The caller claimed to represent the Clearwater Dam Authority and said they were conducting a safety survey of local recreational areas. Mike was excited to help, thinking he was contributing to cave safety research. He gave them detailed information about our planned timing, our route, and how long we expected to be underground. That call should have been a warning, but Mike was so trusting, so eager to share his knowledge, that he never suspected he was talking to someone who had a very different agenda. I remember the morning we left, standing in Mike's driveway at 6 a.m., loading our gear into his beat-up Ford van. Sarah wore this red flannel shirt that made her hair look like spun gold in the early morning light, and I kept stealing glances at her, wondering if I'd finally work up the courage to tell her how I felt during our weekend away. Tommy was already making jokes about how we'd probably all die in the cave and become local legends, while Dave kept checking and rechecking his gear, muttering about how this was a terrible idea. Alex was practically vibrating with excitement, talking non-stop about the adventure ahead. The 2-hour drive felt like it took forever and no time at all. We sang along to the radio, shared stories, and made plans for after we conquered Devil's Throat. When we reached the trailhead, thick clouds had rolled in, and Dave pointed out that the weather forecast had changed. There was now a 30% chance of rain, which meant potential flash flooding in the cave system. But Mike brushed off our concerns, saying he'd been monitoring upstream weather conditions and everything looked clear. He'd even called the local ranger station that morning to confirm there were no flood warnings in effect. What Mike didn't know was that his local authority contact had been feeding him exactly the information they wanted him to hear. The entrance to Devil's Throat Cave was hidden behind twisted roots and moss-covered rocks, about a 30-minute hike up a barely visible trail through dense Oregon forest. When we found it, the opening looked exactly like its name suggested, a gaping maw in the earth that seemed to swallow light itself. Cold air rushed out, carrying the smell of wet stone and something else I couldn't identify, something that made my stomach clench with instinctive fear. Mike began setting up his photography equipment while we double-checked our gear one final time. Each of us carried 3 sources of light: headlamps, handheld flashlights, and emergency backup lights, plus enough batteries to last for hours. We had rope, climbing harnesses, first aid supplies, energy bars, and water bottles. Mike had even brought a 2-way radio, though he warned us that reception would be spotty once we got deep underground. Sarah kept looking nervously at the cave entrance, and I caught her eye for a moment. She looked scared but excited too, the way people do when they're about to do something they know they probably shouldn't. "You ready for this?" I asked her, trying to sound braver than I felt. She nodded and gave me that smile that always made my heart skip a beat. "As long as we all stick together," she said, and I promised her we would. God, I promised her we would. But what we didn't realize was that 2 miles upstream, Clearwater Dam Company was already preparing to open the floodgates that would turn our adventure into a death trap. Mike led us into the cave single file, with me right behind him, followed by Sarah, Tommy, Alex, and Dave bringing up the rear. The entrance passage was narrow and slippery, forcing us to crawl on our hands and knees for the first 50 feet until it opened up into a wider corridor. Our headlamps cut through the absolute darkness, creating weird dancing shadows on the cave walls that looked like monsters reaching out to grab us. Mike kept up a steady stream of commentary, pointing out interesting rock formations and explaining the geology of the cave system, his voice taking on this excited, almost manic quality that should have been our first real warning sign. He was so focused on reaching the cathedral chamber that he wasn't paying attention to the subtle changes in the cave environment, the way the air seemed to be moving differently, the slightly increased sound of water in the distance, the faint vibrations in the cave floor that meant something was changing upstream. We'd been underground for maybe an hour when we reached the junction that Mike had marked on his hand-drawn map as Decision Point. Here, the main passage split into 3 different tunnels. Mike studied his map by flashlight, comparing it to the actual cave walls. The left tunnel was the widest and seemed to slope gently downward. This was the route Mike believed would take us directly to the cathedral. Tommy joked that we should split up like characters in a horror movie, which made everyone laugh nervously. But Mike was adamant that we stick together. Rule number 1 of safe spelunking was never to separate the group. He chose the left tunnel, and we all followed his lead without question. The passage seemed to go on forever, gradually widening and narrowing in an irregular rhythm that made me feel claustrophobic one moment and exposed the next. Sarah stayed close behind me, and I could hear her steady breathing, which was somehow comforting in the oppressive darkness. Tommy had stopped making jokes. The serious nature of our environment was finally starting to sink in for all of us. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, we finally reached what Mike identified as the entrance to the cathedral chamber. The passage opened up dramatically, and our flashlight beams seemed to disappear into a vast darkness that suggested we'd found something truly spectacular. But here's what none of us knew. Every step we took deeper into that cave was being carefully timed by people who wanted us dead. Mike was practically vibrating with excitement as he began setting up his camera equipment, explaining how he was going to capture the perfect shot of rock formations that had taken millions of years to create. The rest of us spread out slightly to explore the edges of the chamber. Sarah found what looked like ancient cave paintings, probably just mineral stains, but mysterious and beautiful in the dancing light of our headlamp. Tommy discovered a small pool of crystal-clear water that reflected our lights like a mirror. Alex was testing the echoacoustics, shouting random words and listening to how they bounced around the chamber. Even Dave seemed to be enjoying himself, studying the rock formations with genuine fascination. That's when we first heard it, a sound like distant thunder, but muffled and continuous, coming from somewhere deeper in the cave system. Mike paused in his photography setup, listening intently, his face scrunched up in concentration. "Probably just the wind," he said after a moment, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. The sound seemed to be getting louder, and Sarah grabbed my arm, her fingers tight with sudden fear. "What if it's flooding?" she whispered, voicing the fear that was starting to grow in all of us. Mike shook his head firmly. "Flash floods make a different sound," he said. "Trust me, I've heard recordings. This is just air movement through the cave system." But even as he said it, I could see doubt creeping into his eyes. The sound continued to grow louder, and now we could definitely identify it as rushing water, lots of rushing water, moving fast through the cave passages somewhere upstream from our position. Dave was the first to say what we were all thinking: "We need to get out of here. Now." But what happened in the next 30 seconds would haunt me forever. Mike started packing up his camera gear with shaking hands, his dreams of the perfect photograph forgotten in the face of very real danger. Tommy and Alex began checking our route back toward the entrance, making sure we remembered which passages we'd taken to reach the cathedral. Sarah stayed close to me, and I could feel her trembling despite her efforts to stay calm. The sound of water was definitely getting closer, and now we could hear something else mixed in with it, a grinding, scraping noise like massive rocks being dragged along by an incredible force. "Move, move, move!" Mike shouted, abandoning half of his camera equipment and grabbing just the essentials. We formed our single-file line again, but this time we were moving fast, almost jogging through passages where we'd walked carefully just an hour before. Our headlamps bounced wildly as we hurried through the darkness, creating a disorienting strobe light effect that made it hard to see where we were going. Behind us, the sound of rushing water was getting dramatically louder, echoing through the cave system like the roar of an approaching freight train. I could feel Sarah's hand on my back as she tried to keep up with our pace, and I could hear Dave breathing heavily behind us, panic starting to creep into his voice as he muttered prayers under his breath. As we reached the junction where we'd made our original route choice, water came rushing around the corner from the middle tunnel, not the way we'd come, but from a completely different direction. The water was moving with tremendous force, carrying debris and rocks, and it was clear that the entire cave system was flooding simultaneously from multiple sources. This wasn't a natural flash flood from surface rainfall, this was something much more massive and coordinated, as if someone had opened massive floodgates upstream and sent thousands of gallons of water crashing through every passage in the mountain. Mike's face went white as he realized what this meant. "The whole system is compromised," he said, his voice barely audible over the roar of approaching water. "Every passage is going to flood." We had maybe 30 seconds before the water reached us. Mike made a split-second decision that probably saved my life and doomed the others. "Jake," he shouted over the noise, "there's an air pocket passage 20 feet up the wall behind you. Climb up there and stay above the waterline. We'll try to make it back to the entrance and get help." I looked where he was pointing and saw a narrow ledge that led to what looked like a small passage carved into the cave wall about 15 feet above the floor level. But it was barely wide enough for one person, and there was no way all 6 of us could fit. "What about everyone else?" I shouted back. Mike was already pushing Sarah toward a different passage, one that angled upward and might lead to higher ground. "We'll find another way. Just go now." The water was ankle-deep around us already, rising fast and getting stronger by the second. I want you to understand something about that moment. I was 24 years old, scared out of my mind, and I trusted Mike completely. When he told me to climb, I climbed. When he told me the others would find their own way out, I believed him. I scrambled up the wet rock face, using every crack and crevice I could find, my fingers slipping on the slimy stone surface. Behind me, I could hear my friends splashing through the rising water, Mike shouting directions, Sarah calling my name. I reached the ledge just as the water level rose to where my feet had been seconds before. But the most terrifying part was yet to come. From my position on the ledge, I could see the main chamber filling with water at an incredible rate. The sound was deafening, like standing next to Niagara Falls, but enclosed in stone so that every noise was amplified and echoed until it became this overwhelming wall of sound that seemed to penetrate into my bones. Mike and Sarah had made it to the upward-sloping passage and were helping Tommy climb up after them. Alex and Dave were trying a different route, wading through waist-deep water toward what looked like another elevated passage on the opposite side of the chamber. For a moment, I thought we were all going to make it. I thought Mike's quick thinking had saved us all, and we'd have an incredible story to tell when we finally got out of this nightmare. But then I heard Sarah scream, not a scream of fear, but a scream of pure agony. The passage she and Mike and Tommy had climbed into was filling with water too, but worse than that, it was collapsing. Chunks of ceiling were falling into the rapidly rising water, and I could see Mike trying to shield Sarah with his body as rocks crashed down around them. Tommy was trapped behind them, caught between the falling stones and the rising water, and I could hear him shouting for help over the impossible noise of the flood. Alex and Dave had reached their passage, but it was clear that it didn't lead upward after all. It was just another dead end that was filling with water just as fast as everywhere else. I was helpless. I could only watch from my tiny ledge as my 5 best friends fought for their lives in the churning, debris-filled water below me. The flood had risen to within a few feet of my position, and I realized that my air pocket wasn't going to save me for much longer either. The water was still rising, and at this rate, the entire chamber would be completely submerged within minutes. That's when I saw something that has haunted my dreams for 34 years. Mike had managed to get Sarah to a small air pocket near the ceiling of their passage, but he couldn't fit in with her, there was only room for one person. I watched him boost her up into that tiny space, using his own body as a stepping stone, and then I watched the water close over his head. Sarah was screaming my name from her air pocket, begging me to help her, but there was nothing I could do. The water was too deep, too fast, and too full of debris for me to swim across to her. Tommy had disappeared completely. I never saw him surface after that first rush of falling rocks. Alex and Dave were still visible, clinging to each other in their flooded passage, but I could see them weakening as they fought against the current. This is exactly when I made the biggest regret of my life. That's when I made the decision that I'll regret for the rest of my life. Instead of trying to help my friends, instead of attempting some kind of desperate rescue mission, I focused on saving myself. I explored the passage behind my ledge, looking for a way to higher ground, hoping to find a route that would take me up and out of the flood zone. The passage was narrow and twisted, barely wide enough for my shoulders, but it did angle upward, and most importantly, it was dry. I could hear my friends calling for help behind me, but their voices were getting fainter as I crawled away from them through the darkness. I spent the next 3 days crawling through passages I'd never seen on Mike's maps, following air currents and hoping they would lead me toward another entrance to the surface. I had one emergency light left when I finally found a way out, not the entrance we'd used, but a narrow crack in the mountainside about half a mile from where we'd originally entered the cave. When I finally squeezed through that crack and felt sunlight on my face again, I collapsed on the forest floor and cried until I had no tears left. The rescue teams found me there 6 hours later, delirious from dehydration and exposure. I told them about the flood, about my friends still trapped in the cave, and they mounted a massive search and rescue operation that lasted for 2 weeks. But by the time they could pump enough water out of the cave system to reach the cathedral chamber, it was too late. They found Mike's body first, still wearing his camera around his neck, wedged against a rock formation about 50 feet from where I'd last seen him alive. Sarah's body was in the air pocket where Mike had lifted her. She'd survived the initial flood, but eventually the water had risen high enough to claim her too. Tommy, Alex, and Dave were found in various passages throughout the cave system, all of them drowned. But what the official report didn't mention, what I've never told anyone until now. The caller who had contacted Mike 3 days before our trip had specifically asked about optimal water flow periods and safe weather windows for cave exploration, questions that didn't make sense for a general safety survey but would be crucial information for someone planning to release massive amounts of water into the cave system. I learned about this call from Mike's girlfriend Jenny, who found notes about the conversation in Mike's journal after he died. Jenny brought this information to the investigators, but they dismissed it as coincidence. The official report concluded that we'd been victims of an unprecedented natural flooding event caused by unusual weather patterns upstream. But I know the truth, and I've spent 34 years gathering evidence to prove it. The Clearwater Dam Company was conducting illegal geological surveys that summer, using high-pressure water injection to map underground mineral deposits. They needed the cave systems to be empty when they conducted these tests, and they were willing to kill anyone who got in their way. You haven't heard the biggest surprise yet. Last month, a former Clearwater Dam employee named Robert Hendricks contacted me through an intermediary. Hendricks had worked in the company's environmental compliance department in 1989, and he'd kept copies of internal memos that proved my suspicions. The company had known about our cave expedition, had deliberately scheduled their water releases to coincide with our trip, and had covered up the evidence afterward by falsifying their operational logs and bribing local officials to suppress any investigation into their illegal activities. The documents Hendricks provided show everything: internal emails discussing eliminating potential witnesses, falsified water release schedules, and payments to local officials who buried the investigation. The company executives who ordered my friends' deaths are still alive, still profiting from the mineral rights they killed to obtain. Hendricks is willing to testify, and I finally have the evidence I need to bring justice for my friends. Next week, I'm meeting with federal prosecutors who specialize in corporate murder cases, and for the first time in 34 years, I have hope that Mike, Sarah, Tommy, Alex, and Dave will finally get the justice they deserve. The Clearwater Dam Company thought they'd buried their crime with my friends' bodies, but they didn't count on one survivor who would never stop fighting for the truth. After 34 years of silence, I'm finally ready to speak. The FBI has opened a formal investigation, and grand jury proceedings begin next month. This won't bring my friends back. It won't erase the nightmares or the guilt I've carried all these years. But maybe, just maybe, it will prevent some other group of young adventurers from trusting the wrong people and walking into a death trap. Mike always said that the most dangerous thing about caves isn't the environment. It's the assumption that other people have your best interests at heart. He was right about that, and I wish I'd understood what he meant before it was too late to save him.